The internet is a massive place, and if you spend enough time clicking through links late at night, you will eventually find yourself falling down some incredibly strange rabbit holes. Some of these are funny, some of them are pointless, and some of them are just weird late night distractions that you end up completely forgetting about by the time you wake up in the morning. But then there are the others, the ones that do not feel like accidents, the ones that feel incredibly intentional, and that slowly lead you down a very dark and narrow path. We are talking about everything from a brilliant programmer building his own computer operating system from scratch because he is convinced it is a direct way to talk to God, to a tragic missing persons case that somehow spirals into a massive hidden network of websites that are nothing short of horrifying. Today, we are diving into some of the most unhinged and deeply disturbing internet rabbit holes in digital history. Every single week, the news is filled with headlines of terrible tragedies. And over time, a lot of us can become somewhat numb to it. We hear about another victim, we feel a brief wave of sadness, and then we go about our day. It is a sad but true reality of the world we live in. We might think about a case for a couple of hours, but then that feeling slowly fades away. But what happens when disaster strikes just around the corner? What happens when it happens to our literal neighbors, when it is right down the street or just next door to where we sleep at night? This is exactly how the residents of a small town called Mumbai in Queensland, Australia, felt on December 7th, 2003. This was the fateful day that a young, bright boy named Daniel Morome left his home around 2 in the afternoon and never returned. Just 2 weeks before Christmas, Daniel was filled with holiday spirit. He decided to head into town so he could buy some Christmas presents for his family. He walked down the road to a bus stop that was located right under a highway overpass. It was a spot he had been to before, a place that felt perfectly safe. But on this afternoon, a series of incredibly unfortunate events began to line up against him. First, the bus that was scheduled to pick him up broke down miles away. Then, the replacement bus that was sent to cover the route was running so far behind schedule that the driver made the decision not to stop for Daniel at all, hoping to make up some time on the route. Daniel was a very patient and polite boy, so he did not panic. He had absolutely no issue waiting for the next bus to arrive. But his real problem was not the bus schedule. The problem was that he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, because at that exact same moment, a man named Brett Peter Cohen was driving his car along that very same road. He saw Daniel standing all alone under the overpass, and he decided to pull over. He rolled down his window and asked Daniel if he needed a ride. To a young boy waiting alone on a hot afternoon, it probably seemed like a very kind gesture, but Brett Peter Cohen's true intentions were incredibly dark. Brett Peter Cohen was a man who already had a history of committing horrible crimes against young people. Yet, due to failures in the justice system, he was still out on the streets. If he had been held in prison like he deserved to be, what happened to Daniel never would have happened. But sadly, it did. Instead of buying Christmas gifts for his family on that December afternoon, Daniel was kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered. The thing is, though, this took an incredibly long time for law enforcement to actually figure out. They did not arrest Brett Peter Cohen until 2011, which was 8 long years after Daniel first went missing. In that time, Daniel's disappearance became one of the most heavily investigated and high-profile crimes in the entire history of Australia. There were massive search parties, hundreds of thousands of dollars offered in rewards, and the entire country sat biting their nails in absolute hope that he would somehow return home safe and sound. This was especially true for the people living in Queensland. Even after the case was finally put to rest and the killer was brought to justice, the tragedy stuck with the community. The residents of Mumbai and the neighbors of the Marome family could not stop wondering how something so horrific could have happened so close to where they lived their daily lives. And of course, that is a completely normal reaction to a local tragedy, but some people began to think about it more than others. In fact, some people thought about it a little too much. They became completely fixated, obsessed, and even tormented by the case. And this fixation eventually led to the creation of an entire massive web ring that was dedicated to Daniel and his life. The police actually managed to catch Brett Peter Cohen through an incredibly complex and highly secretive undercover sting operation known as the Mr. Big technique. Since they had very little physical evidence connecting him to the crime, a group of elite undercover detectives set up an elaborate trap. They created a fake, high-level criminals syndicate and approached Brett Peter Cohen, pretending to recruit him into their organization. Over several months, they paid him large sums of cash to perform small delivery jobs and took him on expensive trips, slowly earning his complete trust. Once Brett was fully integrated into the group, the fake crime boss, known as Mr. Big, told him that a massive, highly lucrative job was coming up. But there was a catch. The boss explained that because the police were constantly monitoring their members, everyone had to confess to their past crimes so that the syndicate could use their wealth and resources to clean up any loose ends. Desperate to secure his place in the gang and receive a massive payout, Brett Peter Cohen finally confessed to the kidnapping and murder of Daniel Marome. To prove his story, he even agreed to lead the undercover detectives directly to the remote search area in the Queensland bushland where he had hidden the boy's remains. As soon as he pointed out the exact location under the trees, the police had all the evidence they needed. They arrested him on the spot, and the long, agonizing 8-year mystery was finally resolved. After the arrest and trial, Daniel's parents, Bruce and Denise Marome, became major public figures in Australia. They did not retreat into their private grief. Instead, they channeled their pain into action and established the Daniel Marome Foundation. Their primary goal was to educate children all over the country about personal safety and to provide immediate support to the families of other missing persons. They created a national safety campaign called Day for Daniel, where millions of school children and citizens would wear red, which was the exact color of the shirt Daniel was wearing on the day he disappeared, and participate in personal safety workshops. Their strength and resilience touched the hearts of the entire nation, turning Daniel's memory into a symbol of hope and child protection. But while most people supported the foundation in normal, healthy ways, others took their interest to a much more extreme and unsettling level. The very first person to publicly notice this strange online network was a Reddit user who went by the name Custom Slaps 659. They made a post on a popular online investigation forum called RBI because they were extremely confused and honestly quite concerned. In their post, they explained that a couple of years prior, while they were searching the web for potential domain names to register for a personal project, they randomly stumbled across a very strange website. This website immediately redirected them to another site called Wishing, which in turn led to an absolutely massive collection of completely different active web domains. The user noted that the websites contained a vast amount of bizarre images and highly cryptic text that initially looked like complete benign gibberish. However, as they explored further, they realized that this one page led to a whole ring of dozens of domains, each featuring a unique set of unsettling images that all appeared to center around the theme of minor abductions in Queensland, Australia. The Reddit user explained that they had been visiting these sites intermittently over the course of a year, and they noticed that the creator was constantly updating the content, changing the images, and adding entirely new pages. Most disturbing of all, the sites were filled with direct references to Daniel Morome and another missing Australian child named William Terrell. If you were to actually click on those links and explore the website yourself, you would find yourself looking at a digital puzzle with a million broken pieces. It is incredibly overwhelming. There are constant repeating themes about pineapples, missing numbers, and a bizarre recurring character who is referred to as Mrs. Notfear or Mrs. Nafear. The physical layout of these pages is deeply unsettling. The background is a solid dark black, and the text is written in bright neon green and red, resembling an old computer terminal from the early days of the internet. There are random animated graphics scattered across the screen, including spinning pineapples, flashing hazard lights, and digital clocks that count down to unknown events. Interspersed between these graphics are real newspaper articles about local abductions, heavily edited photos of the Queensland countryside, and strange hand-drawn maps. Whenever this character of Mrs. Notfear is mentioned on the site, there is often a photograph displayed next to the text. This photograph shows a life-size mannequin dressed up in a bright neon pink nun costume, complete with dark sunglasses and a long synthetic black wig that is styled into two long braids. What this mannequin is supposed to represent or who is behind it is incredibly unclear. The only explanation provided on the website is a highly cryptic passage of text. It reads, "I am Mrs. Not Fear, the mother and number nun of Queensland. From my bottom came the son of Queensland. Now I told him to go away, but the son of Queensland will always return. He is always embarrassing me, pretending to be a stuffed pineapple in a wheelchair who cannot support us anymore." This text does not help explain anything, but it makes it very clear that whoever created this site is based in Queensland and has a massive obsession with pineapples. And this is important for two very specific reasons. First, Queensland is the exact state where Daniel Morome lived and was tragically killed. Second, the bus stop where Daniel was kidnapped was located just about 1 mile down the road from a famous local tourist attraction known as the Big Pineapple. Once you realize this connection, the entire website takes on a much more sinister tone, and it becomes even more obvious when you start to notice that photos of Daniel Morome are literally hidden everywhere on the pages, tucked into the backgrounds of photos and masked behind blocks of text. It is a very subtle design choice, but the level of creepiness is off the charts. It is not just the hidden pictures that are incredibly freaky. It is also the specific way the writer talk about missing children. For example, there is one picture of an old, rusty black car on the site. There is nothing particularly special about the vehicle itself, except for the words that have been manually written over the top of the photo. The text asks, "Have you seen this car in Queensland? This is the naughty car who took away all the little ones away from Queensland." This specific image caught the attention of many online researchers who were trying to map out this web ring. because as it turns out, Daniel was not the only victim mentioned on these pages. The creator of the site also focused heavily on William Terrell, a 3-year-old boy who went missing back in 2014. This disappearance happened quite far away from Queensland, in a town called Kendal, which is located in New South Wales. Unlike Daniel, William was never found, and no physical remains were ever recovered, leading the police to eventually presume that he had passed away. During the massive investigation into William's case, the police announced to the public that they were looking for 2 specific vehicles of interest that had been spotted in the area around the time of the disappearance. A white station wagon and an older style gray sedan, and incredibly, photos of those exact types of cars repeatedly show up all over these websites. While the police description of the cars was somewhat vague, having photos of those exact vehicles on a site dedicated to missing children alongside text calling them naughty cars that take children away is incredibly suspicious and deeply unsettling. So, people online decided to start digging as hard as they could to find out exactly who was running this bizarre operation. In addition to the name Mrs. Nafir, 2 other names appeared constantly throughout the pages: David Smith and John Christopher. After running these names through search engines, users managed to find an old local news article from ABC Queensland about a man named David Smith. The article explained that David was a disabled resident who wanted to raise money for the Royal Flying Doctor Service, which provides emergency medical transportation and care to remote areas of Australia. The article went on to explain that David was trying to raise thousands of dollars for this cause with the active help of his personal caregiver, a man named John Christopher. The news article featured a photograph of David Smith, and it was the exact same photograph that was being used all over the creepy websites. Once the internet community had a solid lead on who was actually behind the domains, they decided to try and get some real answers. Since the article suggested that David Smith was disabled, users chose to send emails directly to his caregiver, John Christopher. They wanted to know why he had built this massive, disturbing network of websites. John actually responded to these emails, and his explanation was very surprising. In his email, John explained that 9Apple was a trademark that he had originally applied for back in 1997. He claimed that the Apple Computer Company in California had tried to prevent him from registering the name, but they failed. He said he had been using the name as a fundraising character for various charities, including the Royal Flying Doctor Service, the multiple Handicapped Association of Queensland, and eventually the Daniel Marome Association starting in 2009. He claimed that the foundation representing Daniel's family was working on a movie called Where is Daniel, and they had offered to include fundraising helpers in the film. John claimed he was officially authorized by Daniel's parents to arrange projects for their cause. He admitted that he owned more websites than he could easily keep track of, but said they mostly focused on missing kids. He explained that he used the sites as a private reference for a future movie he hoped to produce, and he thanked the users for their interest, noting that his sites had been online for over 10 years before anyone finally emailed him about them, but John's responses did not stop there. As more people on Reddit began discussing his sites, some users sent him follow-up emails pointing out that his web ring was causing a massive stir online. John's tone changed, and he sent back a much more defensive reply. He wrote that he had gone through the Reddit threads, and he accused the online investigators of being the real abusers. He claimed that the users were the ones projecting their own warped imaginations onto his photos and egging each other on with weird fantasies. He insisted that the police knew exactly what he was doing and were not investigating him at all. He claimed to be a retired youth and disability support worker who had a long, successful history of working with troubled and missing kids since 1982. And he said that local police had even handed children over to his care in the past because of his good track record. For some online sleuths, this explanation was enough to put their minds at ease. They chose to believe that John Christopher was simply a lonely, highly eccentric retired caregiver who was using these bizarre websites as a form of personal art therapy to cope with the heavy tragedies that had affected his community. Some users even continued to exchange friendly emails with him, and John told them that the websites were his therapy and that he never actually intended for the public to find them. But there were many other people who were not buying John's story at all. And when you look at the facts, it is very easy to see why they remained highly skeptical. First of all, John claimed that these websites were designed to be promotional tools for charity fundraising, but at the same time, he admitted that he never promoted the sites and did not want people to see them. This makes absolutely no sense. If you are trying to raise money for a charity, you want as many eyes on your website as possible. Furthermore, the visual design of these sites is completely terrifying. No legitimate charity or parents association would ever authorize a website filled with creepy mannequins, hidden photos of deceased children, and bizarre, threatening text. It is completely counterproductive to any real fundraising effort. Additionally, while it is true that a movie titled Where is Daniel was in pre-production by the Morome family, John Christopher's name is absolutely nowhere to be found in any news coverage or official documentation regarding the film. The movie was being organized by professional producers and backed by the official Morome Foundation, and they ultimately had to halt production because they could not secure enough funding. There is absolutely no record of John Christopher being authorized by Daniel's parents to do anything on their behalf. In fact, it seems highly likely that the family was completely unaware of his websites, even though the peak of the online discussion occurred around 2019. The mystery surrounding the Nine Apple Pineapple web ring never truly went away. The creator kept updating the domains, and older sites were constantly being redirected to brand new pages. This brings us to February 10th, 2026, when a user named NoOven315 made a highly detailed post on the Internet Mysteries subreddit, bringing the entire case back into the spotlight. The user explained that they had mapped out the web ring and discovered that it was still being actively updated. But they had uncovered a brand new, highly alarming detail. They found that if you typed in a web address related to Ghislaine Maxwell, it would automatically redirect you into the exact same network of websites. When they looked up the history of this domain on the Wayback Machine, they found that it had been active for years, and the content on it was absolutely bone-chilling. The site featured a photograph of two people in a normal living room, but the text box written over the top of the image was deeply disturbing. It read, "I think they are onto us about the Lady Ghislaine site and the reborn doll tracking. Get rid of the wishing car. And there is a house across the road from the Queensland Laboratory Center for Missing Dolls. Boris trafficking his sister Molly? I do not think so, but be prepared." Right next to this image was a photo of the Mrs. Nefer mannequin alongside other terrifying doll-like figures with a caption that read, "Just play dumb and we can pull through this." What makes this discovery even more horrifying is that the name Ghislaine Maxwell and these exact digital addresses were reportedly found in the leaked files and emails of Jeffrey Epstein. In 2011, during the high-profile investigation into Jeffrey Epstein's network, an email was uncovered from Isabel Maxwell, the sister of Ghislaine Maxwell. In the email, Isabel urgently asked Epstein to help make a specific, highly offensive website about her sister disappear from the internet so that no one could see it. Years later, when online investigators were digging through the Nine Apple Pineapple web ring, they discovered that John Christopher had registered a domain name that was almost identical to the one mentioned in the files, and it redirected users directly into his network of websites. While digital records suggest that John did not actually purchase the domain until several years after Isabel's email was sent, the fact that he chose to create a page dedicated to Ghislaine Maxwell, filled with references to human trafficking, missing dolls, and warning messages about getting caught, remains incredibly disturbing. It shows that he was actively paying attention to global scandals and weaving them into his bizarre digital playground. To this day, these websites remain online, constantly shifting, changing, and growing. Some people believe that John Christopher is simply a severely mentally ill man who is trapped in his own elaborate delusions, using the internet to project his inner chaos. And hopefully, that is exactly what this is, because the alternative is far too horrifying to contemplate. If John Christopher actually possesses information about these missing children, or if he is connected to something much larger and more sinister, we can only hope that law enforcement eventually uncovers the truth and puts this digital nightmare to rest once and for all. Now, our second story takes us away from the sunny coast of Australia and drops us into the freezing cold, quiet suburbs of the American Midwest. But, just like our first story, this is a tale of incredible complexity, deep human tragedy, and an online rabbit hole that is unlike anything else in human history. This is the story of Terry Davis and his creation, Temple OS. To understand how this rabbit hole was built, we have to travel back in time to December of 1969, in the dead of winter, in a city called West Allis, Wisconsin. West Allis is a quiet, hardworking suburban area located just outside of Milwaukee. It is the kind of place where families live quiet, predictable lives, and the Davis family was no exception. Except, of course, for the fact that their home was incredibly crowded. They already had 6 children running around the house, and on December 15th, they welcomed their 7th child, a baby boy named Terry. Because Terry's father worked as a highly skilled industrial engineer, the family was constantly on the move. Throughout Terry's childhood, they relocated to Washington, Michigan, California, and Arizona. They never stayed in one place for very long, which meant Terry was constantly having to say goodbye to his friends, pack up his bedroom, and start all over again at a brand new school. This kind of transient lifestyle can be incredibly difficult for a young child, often leaving them feeling isolated and disconnected from the world around them. But while Terry struggled to find a sense of belonging in the physical world, he found an absolute sanctuary in the world of technology. From the moment he learned how to read, Terry was completely captivated by computers. In elementary school, he began teaching himself how to operate an Apple II computer. By the time he was a teenager, he had moved on to the Commodore 64, which was a legendary home computer in the 1980s. It was highly popular because it allowed users to easily learn the basics of computer programming, and Terry took to it like a fish to water. While other kids his age were playing sports or hanging out at the mall, Terry was sitting in his room, completely absorbed in learning assembly language. This is one of the most difficult, low-level programming languages in the world, requiring an immense amount of logical thinking and patience. After graduating from high school, Terry attended Arizona State University, where he excelled in his studies and earned a degree in electrical engineering. Soon after, he landed a prestigious job at Ticketmaster, where he worked as a systems programmer on massive corporate fax machines. To everyone who worked alongside him, Terry was just a quiet, highly capable, and pleasant young man who had a very bright career ahead of him in the tech industry. But what none of his coworkers or family members realized was that Terry possessed a level of intellectual genius that went far beyond typical software engineering. Terry was, by all accounts, an absolute prodigy, and this genius would finally be revealed to the world in 2003 when Terry began coding an operating system he called Temple OS, which he completed in 2013. He had spent 10 long years working on this project, completely by himself, sitting in a small room in his parents' house. To fully appreciate what Terry accomplished, you have to understand that building a modern operating system from scratch is one of the most difficult engineering challenges on Earth. Large technology companies like Microsoft, Apple, and Google employ thousands of elite software developers, spend hundreds of millions of dollars, and utilize massive servers to build and maintain their operating systems. Terry Davis did all of this entirely on his own, without any help from anyone. He wrote over 120,000 lines of code, and he did not use any existing programming languages like C or C++. Instead, he created his own entirely new programming language, which he called Holy C. When Temple OS was released, programmers and software engineers all over the world were absolutely stunned by what they were looking at. Online communities and programming forums were filled with messages from users who openly declared Terry Davis to be one of the greatest programmers who had ever lived. They marveled at the efficiency of his code, the speed of his compiler, and the sheer volume of work that a single human being had managed to complete. To truly appreciate the technical achievement, you have to realize that Terry built the entire system from the ground up, including its own kernel, graphics library, and file system. He designed the operating system to run directly on 64-bit hardware with full multi-core support, which is an incredibly complex task for a single developer. He also built his own compiler, which translated his Holy C code into machine language in real time. He designed Temple OS to have a completely flat address space, meaning there were no security barriers between different programs, giving the user absolute control over the hardware, much like the retro computers of his youth. When asked why he did not include networking capabilities or internet support in Temple OS, Terry explained that God had explicitly forbidden it, telling him that the internet was a source of corruption and that the temple should remain a pure, isolated space. But as the public began to look closer at Terry and his creation, they quickly realized that his incredible genius was accompanied by an equally intense and devastating mental instability. If you were to search for Terry Davis on YouTube or Twitch during this time, you would find a massive library of video content that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Terry had become an internet celebrity, but not just because of his programming abilities. He was known for broadcasting incredibly long, unedited live streams where he would talk directly to the camera for hours on end. And during these streams, Terry would frequently exhibit highly volatile, bizarre, and offensive behavior. He would randomly scream racial slurs at the screen, make wild accusations against invisible enemies, and launch into massive, incoherent rants. In one notorious video, Terry is walking down a public street while recording himself when a black man walks past him in the opposite direction. Without a moment of hesitation, Terry looks at the man, says hello, and immediately calls him a horrific racial slur. The man is completely shocked and angry, and he turns around to confront Terry, asking him why he would say something so incredibly offensive. But Terry does not back down, nor does he look frightened. He stands his ground, looking completely calm and indifferent, and begins arguing with the man, explaining his actions with a bizarre, twisted logic. The video cuts off before the situation escalates further, but it left a lasting impression on everyone who saw it. Terry refused to apologize, and he continued to use this kind of extreme offensive language in almost all of his online content. To a casual viewer, it was easy to write Terry off as a hateful, deeply bigoted person who was simply using the internet to spread anger. But those who knew his history understood that Terry's behavior was actually the tragic byproduct of a severe, untreated mental illness. To find the root of his struggle, we have to go back to March of 1996. Prior to that year, Terry had been a strict, outspoken atheist. Even though he had been raised in a traditional Catholic household, he rejected the concept of God entirely as he grew older, believing only in the physical material world and the logical laws of science. But in 1996, something in his mind completely fractured. He suffered a massive, uncontrollable manic episode that was so severe his family had to have him committed to a psychiatric hospital. He spent some time there receiving treatment, but just 6 months after he was released, he suffered another severe breakdown and had to go back. This pattern repeated itself over and over again. As the years went by, Terry's mental health completely collapsed, and he began to experience intense, terrifying auditory and visual hallucinations. He became absolutely convinced that the Central Intelligence Agency was actively targeting him and tracking his every move. He believed that government agents were following him everywhere he went, and he claimed that these agents actually glowed in the dark. He would tell his online viewers that you could easily spot these CIA agents while you were driving at night, and he insisted that the only logical thing to do was to run them over with your car. This intense paranoia eventually drove him to pack up his things and go on a massive, aimless road trip. He drove for hundreds of miles, constantly looking over his shoulder, convinced that the voices he was hearing in his head were being transmitted directly through his car radio. His fear became so overwhelming that he pulled his car over to the side of a deserted highway, grabbed his tools, and began completely tearing the vehicle apart. He ripped out the dashboard, tore off the door panels, and searched frantically for hidden tracking devices that he believed the government had planted inside his car. When he could not find anything, he abandoned the car entirely, threw his keys deep into the desert sand, and started walking down the highway on foot. A passing police officer eventually spotted Terry walking alone in the heat and, out of concern for his well-being, stopped and put him in the passenger seat of the patrol car. But because of his delusions, Terry did not see the officer as a helper. He was convinced that he had been captured by the enemy, and he became absolutely desperate to escape. Even though the patrol car was traveling down the highway at high speed, Terry suddenly grabbed the door handle, flung the door open, and threw himself out of the moving vehicle onto the hard asphalt. Miraculously, he survived the fall, escaping with only a fractured collarbone. He was rushed to a nearby hospital for emergency treatment, but as soon as the doctors showed him his x-rays, his paranoia flared up again. He looked at the physical artifacts on the x-ray film and convinced himself that they were alien tracking devices that had been surgically implanted inside his body. He leaped out of his hospital bed, ran out of the building, and attempted to steal a car in the parking lot to make his escape. He was quickly arrested by the police, charged with attempted vehicle theft, and placed right back into a high-security psychiatric facility. It was during this stay that doctors officially diagnosed him with bipolar disorder and severe schizophrenia. After this final chaotic series of events, Terry was released from the hospital and moved back in with his parents. His mind seemed to calm down slightly, or rather, his delusions simply took on a brand new form. He decided that his previous atheism was a massive mistake, and he began desperately searching for some kind of spiritual meaning. He spent hours reading the Bible and praying, begging for a sign, and in 2003, Terry became convinced that God had finally answered his prayers. He claimed that God had spoken to him directly, commanding him to build a digital temple where people from all over the world could come to worship and seek divine guidance. This was the exact moment that Terry began coding Temple OS. For the next 10 years, Terry poured every single ounce of his energy and intellect into building this system. He did not view Temple OS as a simple software project. He believed it was the literal third temple of the Hebrew Bible built inside a computer. Because he believed he was working directly for God, Terry let his religious beliefs dictate every single technical decision he made. He programmed a special random word generator into the operating system. If a user pressed the F7 key, the system would immediately generate a random word from a massive dictionary. If they pressed Shift F7, a random passage from the scripture would appear on the screen. Terry believed that this generator was a direct oracle that allowed humans to speak to the Creator. He used it constantly in his own life, consulting the oracle before making any decision, no matter how small. He even kept the graphics of the operating system extremely simple, running in a low resolution of 640 by 480 with only 16 colors, because he claimed God told him that a complex interface would distract children from learning how to code. As Temple OS gained a cult following online, Terry's live streams became a massive attraction. People would tune in for hours to watch this brilliant programmer write incredibly complex code while simultaneously arguing with invisible voices in his room. It was a deeply tragic public display of a brilliant mind slowly coming apart at the seams. As Terry's online presence grew, he attracted a very mixed audience. Many of his viewers were young computer science students who genuinely admired his technical skills and wanted to learn from his streams. They would ask him intelligent questions about coding, and Terry would often spend hours patiently explaining complex programming concepts. But he also attracted a massive group of internet trolls who took pleasure in exploiting his severe schizophrenia. They would call into his live streams, send him harassing messages, and deliberately bait him into launching into his infamous paranoid rants. They would pretend to be CIA agents or government monitors sending him messages designed to trigger his fears of being watched. Terry was incredibly vulnerable, and because of his illness, he was unable to distinguish between genuine interactions and malicious pranks. This constant harassment only served to deepen his paranoia and isolation, driving him further away from reality. In one stream from March of 2017, Terry suddenly stopped speaking, stared blankly into the camera, and told his audience that if you have a thought, an angel can make you forget it, calling it an incredibly oppressive experience. He then began to laugh in a very strange, hollow, and anxious way that went on for a long time before becoming visibly frustrated because he could not remember what he was trying to say. While many people on the internet treated Terry as a joke, creating memes and mocking his rants, others realized that he was a man in desperate need of help. His constant use of racial slurs, which had made him so infamous, was actually a defense mechanism tied to his schizophrenia. He believed that by using those specific words, he could shock and ward off the CIA agents who he thought were monitoring his brain. He was completely trapped inside his own mind, and his only comfort was the digital temple he had built. But the tragedy of Terry's life reached its peak in June of 2018. At the age of 48, Terry's mental state deteriorated to the point where he could no longer live with his parents. He ended up on the streets, completely homeless. Many of his online followers, who deeply admired his programming genius, tried to help him. They offered to buy him food, send him money through PayPal, or book hotel rooms so he would not have to sleep in the cold. But because of his extreme paranoia, Terry refused all assistance. He believed that accepting charity from others was a sin against God and that he had to rely entirely on his own strength to survive. He began traveling across the country, walking along train tracks and highways. He went from Arizona to California and eventually made his way north to Portland, Oregon. On August 11th, 2018, Terry sat down on a public bench outside a library in Portland and recorded one final video for his channel. He looked incredibly thin, his face weathered by the harsh conditions of living on the streets. In the video, he spoke quietly about how he had been using the library computers and how people probably thought he was a bizarre person. He muttered that he was going to be king and described himself as just a little bizarre person who walks back and forth. Only a few hours after uploading that video, Terry was walking along the railroad tracks near a train station in Portland when he was struck and killed by an oncoming Union Pacific train. Because of his severe mental state, investigators were never able to officially determine if he had intentionally stepped in front of the train or if he had simply been disoriented and unable to get out of the way in time. But for the global programming community, the news of his death was an incredibly sad and tragic end to the life of a true flawed genius. When we look back at both of these stories, we are left with a deep sense of tragedy. On one hand, you have the devastating loss of Daniel Marome and the strange, obsessive web rings created by people who could not let the tragedy go. On the other hand, you have Terry Davis, a man whose mind was capable of absolute genius, but who was ultimately destroyed by the very illness that drove his creation. Both stories serve as a haunting reminder of the dark, strange, and tragic corners that exist just beneath the surface of the internet. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.